Swing wide the doors. Aren't you glad it's warm enough that we can swing wide the doors today, as opposed to last week when I awoke at Unity Village to 8 inches of snow, and I was supposed to be speaking down in Joplin, Missouri. Didn't quite make it. Today is the last day of Holy Week on the traditional Christian calendar. And what I'd like to do today is to take a look at the events that led up to that first Easter Sunday. Now, our primary source of information for these stories are the 4 canonical Gospels, the first 4 books of the Christian Testament, the New Testament. And the story appears in all 4 Gospels, but with significant differences between each Gospel. The story began last week with Palm Sunday. If you remember, Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey as a deliberately prearranged counter-procession. He entered accompanied by the peasant class, the poor, the outcast, because his passion was justice and peace and love and compassion, a message which had resonated like no other. And what a lot of us don't know was on the other side of the city, there was an imperial procession. It was the Roman governor entering the town with all the pomp and circumstance of imperial Rome, power, and the theology behind imperial Rome, which held that the emperor was the Son of God, and that power equaled wealth and righteousness. In the days immediately following Palm Sunday, the stories tell us that Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple. He taught a number of very important lessons. And he had major run-ins with the conservative Jewish religious establishment of the day. Now, on Thursday night, some versions of the story have Jesus and his followers celebrating the traditional Jewish Passover festival, including the ritual of serving bread and wine and calling them his body and his blood, given for the forgiveness of sins. Later that night, Jesus went to the garden to pray, where the soldiers came to find him. Friday morning, he was tried, and by noon, he was turned over to the Jewish authorities to be crucified. It's a story that we're all pretty familiar with. Just before sundown, he gave up his spirit. And because Jewish tradition said that you're not allowed to handle a body on the Sabbath, which began at sunset on Friday, he was hastily buried in a nearby tomb, which was sealed with a large stone. Sunday morning, his followers returned to find the stone moved and his body gone. And while I would say that we don't know exactly what happened that first Easter Sunday morning, because the 4 Gospels have fairly radical differences in the way they present the story. Gospels which were written 40 to 70 years after the events that they described. Some say that Jesus appeared in visions. Later on, it was Jesus appeared in flesh. Some of the stories say that he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, others to Cephas or Simon and Peter. But what we do know is this about this first Easter morning. Whatever happened was so momentous that it revitalized Jesus' followers who had scattered in despair just 2 days earlier after the crucifixion. And it gave rise to the knowledge that death cannot keep him. And today, almost 2,000 years later, we still celebrate this event. Now, there are several ways, those of you who have been in unity for any length of time know that there are several ways that we can interpret the stories in the Bible. And unity is very fond of metaphysical interpretation, looking for a deeper meaning in the symbols, in the places, looking for how this applies to my life today. There's also a biblical scholarship that looks at the history and the context. Who wrote what, when, who was the audience, what was the intention behind this story. And then, of course, there's the literal interpretation. What I want to do briefly this morning first is look at Unity's metaphysical understanding of the stories and close with the traditional interpretation and show you how the traditional interpretation came into being and hopefully provide us with a deeper understanding of both interpretations. Charles Fillmore clearly believed, as co-founder of Unity, that the story of Easter was best understood metaphysically. Metaphysical interpretation sees the Bible as the unfolding of human consciousness in the different writings. To do a metaphysical interpretation, we would look at something like the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary or the Revealing Word, familiar Unity texts, and examine the meaning of the words and places. The story of the crucifixion was a favorite of longtime Unity minister and teacher Ed Rabel. And he taught the story of the crucifixion, the cross, as symbolic of crossing out error thought, that we were separate from the divine. He taught it as a release of anything or any thought that no longer served us. A surrender of the human ego so that the Christ consciousness could fully express. And this, he also taught that this is not a one-time event, that resurrection takes place within us every time we let go of error thoughts. And every time that we remember, we are unique expressions of God. Charles Fillmore said that a resurrection takes place in us every time we rise to a realization of the indwelling life that connects us to the divine. This is a moment of at-one-ment or atonement. Now, Christianity has traditionally interpreted the Easter story as the story of Jesus dying to atone for the sins of all humans. His resurrection as his triumph over death, and his ascension back to God. What few Christians today realize is that this interpretation is based on the Jewish liturgy of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Immediately following the crucifixion and the resurrection, Jesus' followers were trying to make sense. They were trying to understand what had happened to their great teacher. How could somebody who had so affected their lives be put to death like a common criminal? Because he had broken through so many boundaries, tribal, political, religious boundaries. He rejected prejudices and stereotypes, teaching love, compassion, and justice. And as they tried to understand, since they were Jewish, they looked to their own religious teachings for a framework that would help them understand what had happened. And they found that framework in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Much of the religious practice of the day consisted of practices trying to bridge the gap of separation between human and divine. You look at some of the Old Testament stories, the story of Noah and the ark, of God wiping out all of humanity and starting over with one family, which didn't work because Noah's family wasn't righteous enough. You look at the giving of law to Moses, God's rules to live by and experience oneness, which failed because the people were unable to live by the law. Then there was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is celebrated every year in the Jewish calendar just as we Christians celebrate Christmas and Easter every year. And on this day, the people perform rituals to overcome their alienation from God and to experience oneness. Now, remember during Jesus' era, the primary way in which Jews worshiped was through animal sacrifice in the temple. On the Day of Atonement, 2 animals were chosen. Both had to be young, healthy, male, and free from blemishes. 1 lamb and 1 goat. The lamb was seen as not only physically perfect, but morally perfect. And it was ceremonially slaughtered by the priest, and its blood placed in the Holy of Holies inside the temple. This was the way that people were brought into the experience of oneness with God through the sacrifice of this perfect animal. And sometimes the priest would even sprinkle the blood onto the people as a way of bringing them more fully into the experience. And they called it being washed in the blood of the Lamb. The goat was then taken to the priest. He would ritually pray over it, confessing all the sins of the people, and symbolically picturing the sins rising out of the people and landing on the head and the back of the goat. And the goat then became the bearer for the sins of the world. The people would then ritually cry out for the death of the goat, but the goat was not put to death, was released to wander in the wilderness. This animal became the scapegoat. Sound familiar? The one who bears the punishment for the sins of the others. So in trying to find meaning in the death of Jesus, his followers looked to the symbology of Yom Kippur. They assigned the lamb and the goat, combined them to one figure, and assigned that role to Jesus. The lamb died for our sins, and the goat had taken away the sins of the world. These phrases were lifted directly from Yom Kippur liturgy and became part of the Christian Bible. Paul was the first to write of this in a letter to the Corinthians in the mid-50s, some 20 years, 2 decades after Jesus' death. And he lifted whole passages from the Hebrew Scriptures in Psalms, Isaiah, and Zechariah. Jesus' death and resurrection became a metaphor for a new ritual of atonement, at one-ment. By the time the 4 Gospels were written, some 20 to 50 years after Paul's letter to the Corinthians, some 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death, this interpretation was already widely accepted, and you see it embedded in all 4 Gospels. It was only as Christianity began to move away from its Jewish roots at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era that the connection to Yom Kippur was lost. However you see it, just like the Jews of Jesus' day, we create spiritual practices in our lives that help remind us of our oneness. Now, we don't use animal sacrifice any longer, unless you count fried chicken and the Easter ham. But we do. We meditate. We practice present moment awareness. We seek to roll away the stone and to grow in consciousness. We practice forgiveness, love, and compassion, just as Jesus did. And we gather together in a spiritual community just like this one to learn and grow. And in unity, we also practice affirmations, affirmative prayer. I am renewed by the Christ presence in me. I rise up. I break down boundaries, release prejudices, and I live in love and compassion. I am one with all that is. And we watch for those resurrection moments in our lives. Those moments when we have that clarity of consciousness, that sudden deep awareness of our oneness. And when those moments come, we celebrate. When the stone rolls away, when we see the light, and we say, Happy Easter. Namaste.